As you are very well aware, as we journey through life, there are days of enjoyment, there are good days, there are times that we just experience God's goodness in our life. And perhaps that was somewhat like last Sunday. You know, the sun is shining, it's nice, and it looks a prefigurement of spring. And then we move to this week and things change. And for those of you who like snow, sorry. Some of you really, want it up as high as you can get it, but we aren't there yet. But we go through life, and there are things that God gives to us that are His gifts of enjoyment. There's family, and there's friends, there's provision that we have, there's the beauty of His creation. There are just things in life that God in His goodness provides to us. However, as we also journey through life, there are going to be dark days. There will be difficult days, even for followers of Jesus Christ. We experience those because we live in a fallen world. Takes us all the way back to Genesis 3, where God institutes and reminds us that because of sin and disobedience, there has been, and the sin has affected every single dimension of creation. We spent a little bit of time on Wednesday night looking at Isaiah that looks future and reminds us that one day during the millennial period, God is going to rejuvenate much of what we see around us, that the lion will lay down with the lamb, and the child will play by a poisonous snake's hole, and they will not be bitten, they will not be destroyed, because God is rejuvenating some of those things. But that's not where you and I live today. And sin has entered into our world, and as a result of that, we get sick, and as a result of that, death has come in and becomes part of our experience. I saw a friend of mine, actually, who's a former student of mine. His family deals with the mortuary business, and he had a mug that he had received from attending a conference that said there's a 99% chance that you won't be at your funeral. I think he missed it by 1%. But that's the reality of it, that because of sin in this world and death, that there is that aspect. But for those who are followers of Jesus, who know Christ, it's a step into the presence of Jesus. Sometimes the things that we experience are the result of other individuals' mistakes and failures. Larry O'Donnell writes about it in his book. He was the CEO of Waste Management, and he and his wife had a young daughter that was going through all kinds of different physical situations. They couldn't figure out what was taking place, and so their physician, their doctor, recommended that they run a number of tests. And so they began running some of these tests, and unfortunately one of the technicians used a setting that was for an adult rather than for a child, and as a result of that, brain damage entered into the life of their young child, and their child has become a special needs child. It was not their failure, but they, as followers of Jesus, have learned and are learning and are writing about those kinds of things and how God encourages them even through some of the dark days through which they walk. Sometimes the dark days are because of choices that we make. And we violate God's instruction for flourishing and human flourishing and living life as God has for us. And we violate those principles. And as a result of that, there are things that enter into our world and that we experience because of that. And in fact, that's part of David's story. So this morning we return back to the story of David that's recorded for our instruction, not just recorded as Aesop's fables to live a nice life, but recorded so that you and I, as we live life, might understand what God has for us and where the dangers are and how to walk with Him. If you remember, King David is king over Israel, and he's facing some very difficult days in his life because he has chosen to violate some principles that God has for him. In previous chapter, in chapter 14 specifically, Absalom, who's David's son, has fled into exile. He has run away from Jerusalem because Absalom had murdered his half-brother Amnon, who had sexually violated Absalom's full sister. And as a result of that, Absalom waited for 2 years, and David did absolutely nothing to discipline or to instruct Amnon. And so Absalom takes matters into his own hands. He kills Amnon, and then he takes off running for his life. And he's been in exile for approximately 3 years. There's a little debate. Is it 2 or 3 years? There's some debate there, but he's been gone. David is growing older, and we're not sure, somewhere around 60 years of age perhaps, and realize that he's going to come to the end of his journey, and that there's the need for succession. Amnon would have been the next in line to be king after David, but he's dead. There's a second individual. We're not real sure what happened to him. So Absalom is third in line, but he is in exile. Joab, who is David's general, is concerned about this succession plan. And so he begins scheming behind the scenes to make it possible for Absalom to come back to Jerusalem so that Absalom would be there should something happen to David. And so if you recall the story in chapter 14, Joab's scheme works. Absalom is brought back to Jerusalem, but David doesn't want to see him. There's been no repentance on Absalom's part. There's been no reconciliation, that there is nothing there. And so Absalom has just been, even though he's in Jerusalem, he's been alienated from his father. And that's been going on for 2 years. And finally, Absalom says to Joab, look, either I see Dad and we make take some steps here, or maybe I'm going to return back to Geshur where I had been. And so there is there's a reunion, but it isn't reconciliation. And so Absalom has been stewing about this for 2 years. That David has not been interested in seeing him. There has not been reconciliation. There's not been restoration. And so Absalom has been stewing about this division for 2 years. And so that's where we pick up the story this morning in 2 Samuel chapter 15. And I invite you to open your Bible, your copy of God's Word, if you want to follow along in a Bible that's there in the chair rack in front of you. It's page 332. Page 332. First of all, we're going to see that Absalom is doing some scheming behind the scenes, and we see that in verses 1 through 9 of 2 Samuel chapter 1. And the first verse informs us that Absalom is interested in chariots, horses, and runners. If you remember the previous chapter, Absalom's a very good-looking man. In fact, the text tells us he has good hair. You remember that? It's in the text. He's a good-looking guy from head to toe. He has good hair, and once a year they would cut it. I don't know if they sold tickets to that event or not, but it was about 5 pounds of hair that they would cut off of him every year, and I suspect that did bring, individuals. For some of us, those days are long gone when we had good hair. They're in the distant past. Well, here it is. Absalom is there, and he's just a very good-looking guy, and he's the king's son. He's the heir apparent. He's the crown prince. But he has very little contact with his father. And so beginning in verse 1, he starts to do this scheming, this plan behind the scenes because he wants the throne. And so in verse 1, it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. Both David and Saul did not have chariots. They did not have horses that they used. It was something that kings did in that day. And so here's Absalom, who is beginning to acquire for himself these external evidences of someone who's kingly. Now, I find it really interesting that he has these chariots and horses, because if you know anything about the topography of Jerusalem, the city, it does not give itself to chariots in the streets. The streets are narrow. It'd be like having a Ferrari or something, you've seen some of those foreign cities that the streets are very narrow, and so it's really a waste of time. But that wasn't really what Absalom was after. He was after style. And so he had his chariot, and he had his horses, and he had his runners before him. Perhaps part of them, get out of the way, here comes Absalom. But it's also the fact, just to give style, 50 runners going in front of himself, presenting himself as a king. That's not the only thing he does. Verse 2. And Absalom used to rise early, stand beside the way at the gate. The gate was was kind of like their courthouse. That was where a lot of business was done. It was where individuals made judgments if you didn't need to go back and see the king. And so Absalom used to rise early, stand beside the way of the gate, and it happened that when a man had a lawsuit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." And Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." So he would be in the process. If somebody was from Judah, the southern tribes, apparently Absalom let them go through. But if they were from Israel, Absalom began to create a division. If you're from Israel, nobody really pays attention to you. Nobody's listening, i.e., Dad isn't listening. Which isn't true, because there was a woman from Tekoa who had been there, previous chapter. And so he's listening, and he's inserting himself. He's judging at the gate. He's trying to win the people to himself. Verse 4, moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that someone would appoint me judge in the land. Then every man who has a suit or a cause would come to me, and I'd give him justice." Now, Absalom's smart enough to say, "Oh, that I were king," because king ultimately was the supreme court of the land. So he doesn't put himself there, but he puts himself in judgment. If I were your judge, I would honor you because your lawsuit is worthy of it. Doesn't it remind you a bit of the commercials we see on television? Have you been injured? Call this number. That's Absalom. You know, if you have a lawsuit, that would be kind of interesting, wouldn't it? If you had two individuals who had a lawsuit against each other and both of them showed up at the same time. "Oh, you're right. You've been defrauded. You're owed money. We can make you right." But what if both of them came at the same time? Might be a challenge. What is Absalom doing? He's trying to win the hearts of the people. That's what he's after. Making promises that he really can't deliver upon. If you've read any of Thomas Sowell's work on economics, he would call this stage one, where individuals who are running for office make promises that they know they can't deliver upon, or if they do, it's going to cause somebody else great disaster, but they're promising you a lot of stuff. That's stage one. That's Absalom. I'm going to win the people's hearts by making promises. In verse 5, we see that he turns himself into a man of the people. And it happened that when a man came near to prostrate himself, put himself down before him, Absalom would take his hand and take him up and kiss him. I mean, that's a photo opportunity right there. You know, here's an individual, because Absalom is crown prince, so they put themselves on the ground and they put themselves prostrate, and Absalom says, "Here, get up, we're equals." He didn't really believe that at all. You know, this is the kiss the babies part. If you've seen any politicians do that. I remember years ago watching an individual who was running for office, and he wanted to present himself. He really wasn't, city guy, but he wanted to present himself as a man of the woods, a man, an outdoorsman. And so they arranged for him to be in his canoe, and he's sitting there in his canoe, and they take pictures of him, and he's looking like he knows what's going on, and somebody else took a picture just a little ways back. He's in 2 feet of water. But he wants to present himself as a man of the people. It's a photo opportunity. And that's exactly what Absalom is doing. Absalom wants to be king. And so he is conniving and he is scheming. And he's successful. Verse 6. And it happened when a man came near to prostrate, verse 6. And in this manner Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of Israel. So they would be going to see David. Absalom would stop them and say, "Hey, let me know what's going on. The line is long, and the king doesn't care as much about you as I do. So let me adjudicate your situation." And he stole their hearts. He creates discontent. Creates discontent. I find it interesting just thinking through human nature. David really was a hero, and Absalom was a celebrity. And even too often in our own culture, we can get caught up and not see the difference between the two. And the people were being caught up by what they saw externally. If you remember, David was the individual who fought Goliath. David was the individual who led Israel's armies out into war successfully with God's help. David was the one who ran from Saul for 10, 13 years until God put him on the throne. David was the individual who was not willing to put himself on the throne unless God put him there. He was not going to take any shortcuts in his life to achieve the position. Absalom was raised as a son of a king with all that goes along with it. He was raised in luxury. He's never fought a battle in his life. He wouldn't know what to do with a sword and a spear if it were handed to him. And the people are falling for someone who is a celebrity. But it works. And so Absalom then, to kind of finalize this scheme that he has, he says in verse 7, he said, I want to go to Hebron and I want to pay a vow. Made a vow to God when I was back in Geshur that if God brought me back to Jerusalem, that I would honor that, I would worship. And so that's what you see in verse 7. It came about at the end of the 40 years that Absalom said to the king, it really should read 4 years, that Absalom said to the king, please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron, for your servant vowed a vow while I was living in Geshur and Aram, saying, if the Lord indeed would bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said to him, go in peace. So he rose and went. He's asking to go pay a vow. I made a vow 4 years ago that if God brought me back here to Jerusalem, that I would honor the Lord. I would serve the Lord. That is not at all what he's doing. God, if you just bring me back, what's he doing? You know, he didn't pay a vow. The Bible tells us, in fact, you can read about it in Ecclesiastes, that if you make a vow before God, it's pretty significant and that we ought to pay it. In fact, we've heard that terminology, perhaps the foxhole prayers. You know, God, if you get me out of this foxhole, came out of the military situation, you're involved in a battle and bullets are flying and you're not sure you're going to get out alive. And God, if you just get me back home to the States alive, I'll go to church maybe 4 times a year. I'll put some money in the offering plate. I'll be nice to my neighbor. I'll do something positive for people around me if you just get me back. But we often use that, unfortunately, God, if you just do this for me, then I will do. And we use it as a means of attempting to buy God. Why did Absalom wait 4 years? If he really made this vow, why didn't he do it immediately when he was brought back? In fact, the content of the vow in verse 8, if the Lord brings me back, then I'm going to serve the Lord. I question whether or not he really made the vow. He's not a religious person at all. He has no interest in the one true God of Israel. We don't see that anywhere in his life. I think he made this up. It just sounds spiritual. God told me to tell you. And then you go on. I don't think God was involved in it at all, but was using religion to accomplish his purposes. They were using God to accomplish his purpose. And the interesting thing in verse 9, David grants permission. I don't know why he does that. If you would remember about 6, 7 years previous to that, when Absalom had said to David, hey, I want to go up and we're going to hold a festival because of the sheep shearing. Man, don't say it too close together. The sheep shearing Some of you are, I can tell by your laugh. Because the sheep shearing is over, and so we want to hold a festival. And so David kind of is hesitant to go, but he says, go on, and he take all the king's son. And that's where Absalom plans, and he does, murders Amnon. And so I wonder, why did David do this? Absalom has been going through the city streets on his chariot with his horses and with 50 runners. Absalom has been contacting individuals in an attempt to sway his heart, the heart of the people. Why is David, as dad, not involved? Now, Absalom's about 30 years of age. But David has been an AWOL dad in the lives of his sons and his children all of their life. And so is that just a continuation? David just doesn't want to fight it anymore. David is tired and saying, you just go do what you want to do. Sometimes parents, we come to the end of our stage. It's like, I'm tired of fighting with you. David could have said no. Would have forced the hand of Absalom. But he doesn't. And Hebron is a pretty important place. It was chosen for a reason by Absalom. David was crowned king at Hebron. Absalom was born at Hebron. It was a sacred city that should have raised some warning signs in David's mind. But it doesn't. And so we see in verses 1 through 9, Absalom schemes to take the throne. And then in verses 10 through 13 is Absalom's revolt. He's successful in doing this. And Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say Absalom is king. So he sends his individuals out to the cities, and at the proper time, when you hear the words, you are to arise and say Absalom is king. That's pretty straightforward. It's a stirring support that he has already received. It's to make it look spontaneous. And then there's some invited guests in verse 11. And 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem who were invited. But notice the next phrase, they went innocently, did not know anything. It's important to understand, who do we spend time with? Who's influencing us? These are 200 individuals who, I don't know, they thought it was going to be a good meal or what, but they're hanging out with a guy who is trying to take the throne. The Bible warns us, don't be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. I know of individuals who have ended up being arrested because they were hanging out with somebody who loved breaking the law. They didn't mean to, they didn't want to, they didn't plan to when they went with them, but they went, and they were hanging out with individuals who were lawbreakers. And they ended up in situations they didn't want to be in. And I think that's the situation here with these 200 individuals. Absalom invites them to give some credibility to what he's doing. And so they go. They go. Verse 12. This is important. We'll come back to this individual. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gileonite and David's counselor from his city of Gilo, while he was offering his sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. We'll come back. Ahithophel's a big deal. You see, he was David's counselor. And then David gets news of the revolt in verse 13, and the messenger came to David saying, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. That's when you get that preliminary response. Everybody's following Absalom. Everybody is following Absalom. And so he gets news, which David begins to enter then these dark, dark days, which we see in verse 14. David plans a strategic retreat. In verse 14, and David said to all of his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise, let us flee, for otherwise none of us shall escape from Absalom. Go in haste, lest he take over the city and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." David doesn't know how many individuals are following him. Sounds like the vast majority of the individuals have fled and left for Absalom. And so he said, he doesn't have an army that he can raise up. And so he says, it's time to get out of here. It's a strategic retreat. It's interesting, there's some individuals we come through. Ittai, who is the Gileadite, which is the Gittite. An interesting individual. Servants, the king's servants, verse 15 said, "Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever you ask." David has a small hand group of individuals. King went out with all of his household. King left behind his 10 concubines. They were the legal mistresses to take care of things while he's gone, to keep the house in order. Illegal mistresses of that day wasn't approved by God, but nevertheless, that's what they did. King went out, verse 17, with all the people. Now all of his servants passed on beside him. And then in verse 19, the king, this is Ittai the Gittite. Interesting correlation there, right? Ittai the Gittite. What's that? Ittai is from Gath. Do you remember where Gath is? Where? It's a Philistine. David had fought Philistines a lot of his life, but here is an individual who has come to know the one true God. In fact, you see it, we'll see it in just a moment. And David asked him, "Why are you going to go with us? You just sort of joined up." I don't know I don't think it means the immediate. It says, you just became part of us yesterday. I think it means just recently. We say that, just yesterday such and such happened. He just recently joined. And David said, "This isn't your fight. This isn't your battle." That's verse 20. You came yesterday. And, why don't you go back? And they were probably part of the mercenary group. Verse 21, this is what Ittai says. He says to the king, "As the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, surely where my lord the king may be, whether for life or death, there your servant will be." Ittai says, I know that you're a follower after God. Yes, I see that evidenced in your life, even with the fallenness that's taken place. But I will hitch my wagon to you. I'm going to follow you. It might be death, or it might be life. I don't know. But I trust God, and I'm putting my trust in Him. It's a statement of faith and a statement of commitment. It was a statement of encouragement to David in these dark days. And in verse 23, we see David and his bodyguards leaving. And so in verse 23, while all the country was weeping with a loud voice, all the people passed over. There are more that were behind David than what he understood at the very beginning. But he realized David didn't want to cause a civil war. David cared about the people. David wasn't interested in his own well-being. It wasn't the fact that he was going to hang on to that throne regardless of what happened to other people around him. As we will see in a moment, David says, this throne is God's throne. If God wants me on the throne, I will be here. If God doesn't want me on the throne, I will not be here. But I am not going to grasp after this throne and hurt the people around me. That's a true follower of God. Can contrast that to Absalom, the celebrity. I don't care who gets hurt. I'm going to grab the throne. I'm after the throne. And so they leave weeping. Again, God sends a couple of individuals. And in our times of darkness, when we face those dark times, God brings into our path, into our journey, faithful individuals who can encourage us. And we see that with Zadok and Abiathar, verse 24. And Zadok also came, and all the Levites with him, carrying the ark of the covenant of God. And they sat down the ark of God, and Abiathar came up, and with all the people finished passing from the city. And verse 25, the king said to Zadok, "Return the ark of God to the city. If I find favor in the sight of the Lord, then he will bring me back and show me it and his habitation. But if he should say, I have no delight in you, behold, here I am. Let him do to me just what seems good." That's a heart of an individual who is following God through dark days. If you recall, the ark was that 2 by 2 by 4 feet box in which had been used to represent God's presence. It was inside of the Holy of Holies, and that was used to represent God's presence. God doesn't live in a little box, don't misunderstand. But it represented God's presence. And remember, Eli's son carried it off into battle thinking it's a good luck charm. If we just have this good luck charm with us, nothing bad will happen. And the ark was taken by the Philistines. And they thought they won the battle. They thought their gods were stronger than the God of Israel, but it wasn't the case. And so I think Zadok and Abiathar, they brought the ark thinking this is not only we don't know what's going to happen back in Jerusalem, but this will help our cause. And David says, you know, my restoration back to Jerusalem is not based on God's furniture. It's based on God's favor. I'm not going to use God for my own personal gain. I'm not going to use the things of God for my personal gain. I like verse 25, 26. I found those to be very encouraging. As we face those dark days, God will bring me through. Or God may take me home. But I'm going to trust God. I'm not going to use God's stuff for my gain. And so we see as a result of that, there's, however, some strategic planning. It isn't a matter that when we go through these times and we face difficult days that we just sort of say, well, I'll just sit back and see if something good comes out of this. David begins doing some planning, and you see that in verse 27. He's not passive. The king said to Zadok the priest, are you not a seer? In other words, don't you have wisdom? Aren't you able to perceive certain situations, difficult situations? The answer was yes. It's a rhetorical question. Return to the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you, Amahaz and Jonathan, and the son of Abiathar. And see, I'm going to wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. In other words, they're going to be the spies back in Jerusalem. I'm going to wait to a place that crosses the river where it's low, and you can bring me word as to what's going on. Has Absalom been successful? Is he not? Are the people's hearts being turned? Are they not? What's taking place inside of Jerusalem? I'm going to wait at the fords. They didn't have a way to text, but I need to know. Verse 29, therefore Zadok and Abiathar returned the ark of God to Jerusalem, and they stayed there. They remained there. And then we see David going up onto the Mount of Olives. And we went up, verse 30, wept, and as he went, his head was covered, and he walked barefoot when all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping. It was a sign of mourning. David is weeping because of what has taken place. He's lost the throne. These are somewhat consequences of decisions that he made in the past. And he's beginning to get the effect of God is forgiven. Don't misunderstand. But sometimes in our choices and our decisions, there are consequences that we cannot undo. And so David is weeping. He's barefoot. It's a sign of mourning. We went through recently a passage that we were looking at in Isaiah that in our Wednesday nights that references the fact that God weeps with his people. That God sees what we are going through, and he cares, and he's concerned, and he weeps with those who weep. Jesus did that, of course. We mentioned that previously. That our sorrow and our heartache affect God. God is not immune to those things that we go through, just like you as a parent. When you have a child who's hurting, whether they be young or adult, there's care and there's concern. And there's more disappointment. Because then we read this, verse 31. Now someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. He had been one of David's close friends. He had been one of David's counselors. He had eaten at the table of David. And yet he has joined the revolt. Who's Ahithophel? He's Bathsheba's grandfather. Remember, David had committed adultery with Bathsheba, probably forced her into a situation that she did not want to be in. And so Ahithophel, this wise individual, has switched parties, and so David prays, God, I pray that someone somehow makes the counsel of Ahithophel foolish because he's a wise guy. He's a wise individual. If he is counseling Absalom, that's not good. You know what? God answers a prayer. Look at verse 32. And it happened as David was coming to the summit, the peak of the Mount of Olives, where he was worshiping God. David is going through this difficult time, and yet he's worshiping God. He realizes that his only hope is in the one true God. Who else is there? You read some of the Psalms where David writes, who else is there? Who else is there besides you, oh God? If I reject you because of this difficulty through which I am going, who else is there? What other help is there? And so he gets to this top of the Mount of Olives and he worships God. He renews his relationship. He understands. He recognizes. Perhaps that reminds you of the book of Job. We're on a tragic day, a day such perhaps as bad, if not worse, than what David is facing, where he loses all of his kids and their husbands, and he loses everything he owns. And we read he worshiped God. God, I'm going to trust you. I don't understand it. Don't understand it. But I'll trust you. I'll trust you. So verse 33, and David, this individual, Hushai, arrives, the Archite, met him with his coat torn, again demonstrating sorrow. And David said to him, if you pass over with me, then you'll be a burden to me. We don't know. Someone suggested because he was an older guy. We don't know. Maybe, you're going to slow us down, very possibly. Or it's just adding more mouths to be fed as we try and figure this out, place to live. And so he says, here's what I'd like for you to do. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I'll be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in the past, so I will now be your servant, then you can thwart the counsel of Ahithophel for me. You see it? God, I need somebody to thwart Ahithophel's counsel because it's wise counsel. He's a wise man. And God sends him Hushai, and David says, here's what I need you to do. I need you to be the counter to Ahithophel. I need you to go back. Why did that happen? Because David prayed. Because David prayed. And he also says there are others inside the city who are on our team. Zadok, verse 35, Zadok and Abiathar the priests with you there. So it shall be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall report to Zadok and Abiathar. So David has someone on the inside of the council, the cabinet of Absalom, the inner circle. And so Hushai, whatever you hear within that inner circle, you make mention to Zadok and Abiathar, and they'll see that I get word as to what is taking place. And behold, the two sons of Ammihaz, Zadok's sons, and they were kind of the runners for it. And so that's what took place. And then we read in verse 37, so Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom came into the city. It's rather interesting. If you look at the topography, if this were Jerusalem and this is north, Mount of Olives would be on the east, and it would be there that King David goes. Absalom enters from the south. It's like he got out just in time. So Absalom enters from the south and he comes in. So how do we respond? There's an interesting psalm that David wrote, Psalm 3. During this time, I'm going to read a portion of, actually I'm going to read all of it to you. It's only 8 verses. It's a psalm that was written as David is fleeing. In fact, if you look at the title of it, it says, A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom. So perhaps that next morning, when he's worshiping God, this is what is running through his mind as he is facing dark days. O Lord, how my adversaries, this is verse 1, have increased. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there's no deliverance for him in God. Stop and think about that. There will be times in our life in which we are going through the difficult days, and people are going to say, why'd you trust God? Look at what's going on with you. He didn't prevent that problem. He didn't keep you out of it. You put your faith and trust in God, that's worthless. Why are you trusting in God? Why do you still trust him? He didn't answer that prayer. He didn't do that for you. You still are facing dark days. You've been there. Maybe you've been there for a month. Maybe you've been there for years. Why are you still trusting God? Why do you put your hope in him? Because he didn't deliver. And then David goes from the horizontal to the vertical, and he says this, but you, O Lord, you are my shield, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. And I lay down and slept, and I woke, for the Lord sustains me. Again, I think this is when David fled. So this would very potentially be the very next morning. I lay down and slept. I woke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000 of people who have set themselves against me and around me. I'm going to trust you, God. I'm going to trust you. That's all that I've got. But that's more than enough. And so there is those who say, why are you trusting God? Others say, David says, I've seen his faithfulness in the past. And so I'm going to trust him. And then verse 7, the prayer for deliverance. O Lord, save me. O my God, you have smitten all mine enemies on the cheek. You've shattered their teeth. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Thy blessing be upon your people. And so as we face those difficult days, Psalm 3 is a great psalm for us to go back to and to be reminded about. That even when individuals saying, why are you bothering? Why are you bothering going to church? Why are you bothering singing praise? Why are you bothering opening up your Bible? Why are you bothering spending time with God? And David says, there's nobody else who can help me. I've seen the faithfulness of God in the past. And God, please deliver me. I need your help. And so for those of us who are followers of Jesus, this is a legitimate prayer and psalm for us. But I'm also reminded, if we fast forward 1,000 years, that Jesus Christ himself went up to the Mount of Olives, Garden of Gethsemane. He had just been with his disciples in the upper room. They had been there together celebrating what Jesus referred to as, or what we refer to as the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper that they spent together. Judas has gotten up and left to go betray Jesus. He's gone to meet the religious leaders to bring them to Jesus because he knows where they're going to be. And so Jesus with the 11 now take them to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he has the 11 there, and then he takes 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, and they go on a little bit further. And he says, I want you to watch and pray so that you don't enter into temptation. Jesus didn't ask them to pray for him. And then Jesus goes a little bit further. And he says, my soul is grieved to the point of death. But there is a significant difference between the two. David was experiencing what he was experiencing because of his disobedience and his sin against God. And there's some consequences for that. Jesus was preparing to go to the cross on that weekend, to be tried before Pilate and Herod, to be beaten, to be abused, to be betrayed, and ultimately to die on the cross. And it wasn't for his sins. It was because of your sin and mine, our failure. And Jesus prayed, if it's possible, take it from me. But understanding that this was God's plan for your redemption and mine before a holy God, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And it's interesting as you read in one of the Gospels that an angel came and ministered to him. That God responded to the prayer. And it wasn't a matter that, okay, I found another way. There was no other way. But I'll help you through. I'll strengthen you. I'll minister to you. And then Jesus headed to the cross, facing the darkest days of his life for you and for me, that whosoever believes in him will have eternal life that starts here and now. And the message of hope that we have as we walk through the dark days is that Jesus has taken our sin and our failure, and we can trust him. He knew what he was doing. He was betrayed and died and rose again for our sin. And he alone is our hope. Maybe you're here this morning and you came with someone and you say, man, I'm not sure I understand that piece. Ask them, maybe over lunch, what does that mean? Or we're happy to have a discussion because somebody told us about what Jesus had done for us so that our eternal life is secure, starts here and now, and goes on forever. Let's pray. Father, thank you that Christ was willing to suffer the dark days, to begin the journey, to ultimately give his life and to rise again, something that we will commemorate as he instructed us to do next Sunday. And Father, thank you that you give us hope even in our dark days. These are not accidents that occur within life. That the story that we read about David is a reminder to us of your faithfulness even in our failures. And so that what we do is in our difficult days, we pray and we plan and we place our trust in you, God. That we spend time in prayer. That we do plan, but ultimately our trust is in you. And Father, I know within our own church family there are individuals, even this day, who are going through difficult days. Some have been in it for a few years, a number of years. I pray your encouragement to them. That you are our salvation and you are our hope now and forever. Father, every single one of us will enter difficult and dark days because we live in a broken world. Sometimes because of our choices, sometimes because of choices of others around us, sometimes just our world in which we live. But thank you that you care enough about us, that Jesus came to redeem us, to purchase us, so that this is not our ultimate destiny. And so we pray this in his name. Amen.